Melania Trump destroys Joy Behar. Host The View over. After Melania Trump sues for 100 MIT was just another typical day on The View. The cameras were rolling, the studio lights were shining down, and the hosts were getting ready for their usual round of political banter. But on this particular day, the tension in the air was palpable. What began as a lighthearted conversation quickly turned into an attack that would spark a firestorm. Joy Behar, never one to hold back, began her opening segment with a sharp jab at Melania Trump. "She doesn't even want to be the First Lady," Joy said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "She redecorated the Rose Garden like she was flipping a foreclosed condo." The audience burst into laughter, and the applause followed like clockwork. But this wasn't just a joke. This was an opening salvo, a calculated strike designed to undermine Melania Trump, a woman who had been largely silent throughout the political upheaval that had defined her husband's presidency. Whoopi Goldberg, always one to add fuel to the fire, chimed in. "She sleeps in a different wing," Whoopi said, adding fuel to the notion that Melania's marriage to Donald Trump was somehow unusual, distant, or detached. "She's a hostage with a designer wardrobe," she quipped. The audience laughed again, feeding into the narrative that Melania was nothing more than a figurehead in a gilded cage. Sunny Hostin, who had often sided with the more progressive elements of the show, nodded in agreement. "She can't even decorate a Christmas tree without pouting," she added. The audience erupted with laughter, the mockery of Melania Trump reaching a fever pitch. But while the studio was full of laughter, something far more serious was brewing outside the walls of The View. Melania Trump, who had remained mostly silent throughout her husband's tumultuous presidency, was about to make her presence known in a way that no one could have anticipated. Melania had long been criticized for her quiet demeanor, often portrayed as aloof or indifferent. But this time, she wasn't going to stay silent. She wasn't going to let Joy Behar and her co-hosts tear down her reputation without consequence. Within 72 hours of the episode airing, Melania Trump's legal team filed a defamation lawsuit against ABC and the three hosts, Joy Behar, Whoopi Goldberg, and Sunny Hostin, seeking a staggering $100 million in damages. The lawsuit accused them of maliciously defaming her character, claiming that their words weren't just political commentary, but targeted harassment disguised as comedy. The timing of the lawsuit was calculated. Melania's legal team knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't just fighting back for Melania's honor. They were taking a stand against the kind of media bullying that had become all too common in the political sphere. The media buzzed. News outlets scrambled to cover the fallout. Social media erupted with a flurry of hashtags, memes, and heated debates. The Melania Speaks, The View Shamed, and Justice for Melania trended on Twitter. Some defended the hosts, claiming their words were protected under the First Amendment and that it was simply satire. Others saw this as a targeted personal attack, one designed to tear down a woman who had been thrust into the political spotlight but had never asked for it. But the most damaging piece of evidence came not from the show itself, but from a leaked backstage clip that went viral. In it, Joy Behar was caught whispering to Sunny Hostin, "She's fair game. Trophy wives don't get privacy." That moment, caught unintentionally, changed the tone of the entire conversation. What had once been dismissed as comedic banter now seemed like a personal vendetta against Melania. It wasn't just about political commentary. It was about hatred and contempt. Melania's legal team seized on this moment, crafting a public statement that sent shockwaves through the media. "Being First Lady is not a shield from scrutiny," Melania's spokesperson said. "But it should not be a license for cruelty. This was not comedy, this was character destruction." And just like that, the story moved from the realm of political talk shows into a full-blown legal battle. The tone of the debate shifted dramatically. What had once been a simple television segment was now the subject of a national conversation about media accountability, the line between political commentary and personal attack, and the very nature of free speech in the age of social media. As the lawsuit progressed, the legal team unearthed emails and documents that revealed a disturbing pattern. Internal communications from the View staff showed that Melania's name had been treated not as a first lady but as a ratings tool. A producer had written, "Melania bashing gets engagement. Whoopi's comments last week got us trending. More of that." It was clear now. Melania wasn't just a political figure. She was the target of a concerted effort to bring her down, not because of her actions or her policies, but because of her role in the Trump administration. But Melania Trump was far from powerless. The more information her legal team uncovered, the more it became apparent that the hosts and producers of The View had been using her as a punching bag for their own entertainment, all while disguising their attacks as political satire. The battle lines were drawn. Melania had become more than just a former first lady. She had become a symbol of resilience against a media landscape that had grown too comfortable in its mockery and disdain for conservative figures. With the lawsuit, she wasn't just seeking financial compensation. She was sending a message to the media and to the public. The days of unchecked cruelty disguised as humor were over. And as the legal battle unfolded, it was clear that the stakes were much higher than anyone could have imagined. The air was thick with tension after the legal papers were filed. Melania Trump's lawsuit against ABC and the hosts of The View was now the subject of every news cycle. The public was divided, with some applauding her courage, while others claimed she was overreacting. Regardless, Melania had shifted the conversation. No longer would she be a passive figure, the butt of jokes on late-night talk shows or political commentary. She was taking control of her narrative, and she wasn't backing down. In the days that followed, social media became a battleground. Supporters of Melania flooded Twitter with hashtags like #Melania Speaks and "All Justice for Melania." Conservative pundits rallied behind her, claiming that her lawsuit wasn't just about her. It was about standing up for all women and public figures who had been subject to personal attacks under the guise of free speech. On the other side, progressives mocked her legal move as an overreaction, dismissing it as a frivolous attempt to silence free speech. Despite the division, one thing was clear. The lawsuit was about more than just one episode of The View. It was about a larger issue, the rising trend of personal attacks masked as political discourse. Melania's lawyers weren't just aiming to win a legal battle. They were making a cultural statement, one that sent shockwaves across the media landscape. The first major hurdle in the case came when Melania's legal team uncovered a series of emails and internal communications from ABC producers. The emails revealed that the producers of The View had not just taken potshots at Melania as a political figure, but had actively sought to use her for ratings. In one email, a producer wrote, "Melania bashing gets engagement. Whoopi's comments last week got us trending. More of that." It was no longer just about political discourse. It was about monetizing hatred and mockery. Melania's team seized on this evidence, presenting it to the public as a clear case of defamation. They argued that the hosts of The View had crossed a line between political commentary and personal degradation. This wasn't satire. It was targeted harassment. In response, ABC and The View mounted a defense that centered on the First Amendment. They claimed that the hosts had the right to express their opinions, even if those opinions were critical or harsh. Joy Behar, Whoopi Goldberg, and Sunny Hostin doubled down on their remarks, with Behar defending her comments as comedic and in the spirit of satire. However, this defense started to falter as more evidence came to light. The turning point in the case came when a backstage clip was leaked by a stagehand, showing Joy Behar whispering to Sunny Hostin, "She's fair game. Trophy wives don't get privacy." That simple remark was the smoking gun Melania's legal team had been looking for. It wasn't just a matter of political differences. It was a clear instance of contempt, of treating Melania Trump as a target, a joke to be mocked for sport. The backlash was swift and fierce. ABC executives, who had previously been confident that their free speech defense would prevail, were now scrambling. They had never anticipated that their internal communications would become public, exposing the calculated efforts to use Melania for ratings. As the legal team continued their investigation, more damning evidence emerged. Internal documents showed that Melania's name had been identified as a ratings magnet long before the infamous The View episode. One internal PowerPoint presentation even listed Melania at the top of a list of targets that trend. The memo suggested that producers actively sought out controversial topics involving Melania because they knew it would drive engagement and boost viewership. The evidence of a strategy to use Melania's personal life for ratings was undeniable. It was no longer about political critique. It was about a culture of cynicism, one where personal attacks were used to generate profit and fuel media cycles. Meanwhile, Melania remained relatively quiet in the public eye. Her legal team, however, was relentless. They filed motions, publicized select findings, and leaked just enough material to keep the pressure on ABC. They were careful and strategic, always staying one step ahead of the media. The lawsuit was no longer just a legal battle, it had become a media spectacle. On television and in courtrooms, the fallout was intensifying. The View's legal team argued that their show was a platform for free speech, citing the First Amendment as their shield. But Melania's attorneys quickly turned the tables. They argued that while free speech was protected, it did not give anyone the right to defame, harass, or humiliate another person. ABC's legal team realized that they were in uncharted territory. They had underestimated Melania's resolve. The lawsuit wasn't just about Melania defending herself. It was about setting a precedent for how the media could treat public figures without consequence. If Melania won, it could change the way media outlets operated, forcing them to reconsider the line between critique and defamation. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the View hosts were reportedly feeling the pressure. Joy Behar, who had been the most vocal in her attacks, was said to be particularly defensive. Whoopi Goldberg, ever the professional, tried to maintain her composure, but there were whispers of internal friction between the hosts. Sunny Hostin, who had initially defended her remarks, seemed to recognize the gravity of the situation. As the legal case moved forward, a strange silence fell over the View. The hosts were instructed to avoid commenting on the lawsuit during live broadcasts. It wasn't just about the legal consequences, it was about protecting the show from further damage. The studio audience, once boisterous in their support for the hosts, began to quiet down. The usual snarky remarks and political jabs were replaced with awkward pauses and stilted conversations. It was clear that the show had been rattled to its core. But even in the face of mounting pressure, Melania's legal team was unwavering. They had already begun planning phase 2 of their strategy, discovery. They filed subpoenas requesting access to internal emails, phone records, and off-air conversations that could reveal more about the culture of mockery at The View. The pressure on ABC was mounting, and they knew it. As the lawsuit continued to unfold, Melania's quiet strength and determination were becoming more evident. She had been the subject of mockery, but now she was the one calling the shots. With every piece of evidence her legal team uncovered, it became clear that the fight was no longer about one segment on a talk show. It was about challenging a media culture that often blurred the line between free speech and cruelty. ABC executives, once confident in their legal defense, were now facing the harsh reality of their actions. They had underestimated Melania Trump, and now they were paying the price. The media landscape was changing, and Melania's lawsuit was at the center of it. But what was most striking about the case was Melania herself. She had always been seen as a quiet, passive figure, but now she was fighting back, not with words but with legal precision. Her silence, once mistaken for indifference, was now understood as strength. She was no longer just a former First Lady. She was a woman reclaiming her dignity, refusing to be anyone's punchline. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the case of Melania Trump versus ABC moved forward. It had become much more than a simple defamation lawsuit. What had started as a personal attack from Joy Behar and the other hosts of The View had now escalated into a full-scale cultural war. Melania Trump wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for all public figures who had ever been subjected to mockery disguised as satire. Her legal team continued to dig deeper into ABC's operations, uncovering more unsettling details. The documents that came to light painted a damning picture of how The View had intentionally used Melania Trump as a ratings magnet. What had seemed like a careless comment on the show had now morphed into a deliberate strategy to exploit her for profit. Among the most shocking revelations was an internal memo that clearly outlined a plan to target Melania for maximum engagement. The memo, which had been circulating among The View producers, contained detailed instructions on how to frame Melania's actions and personality for maximum controversy. Use metaphors tied to luxury and distant silence, it advised. Make her seem out of touch with the American people. Make her the perfect villain for our audience. This wasn't just about critiquing Melania Trump's policies or her role as First Lady. It was about deliberately painting her as the ultimate target for scorn, stripping her of her humanity and reducing her to a caricature. Every comment, every segment, every joke made at her expense had been carefully planned, manipulated, and weaponized to generate outrage and, more importantly, to boost ratings. Melania's legal team seized on this. They argued that this wasn't political satire or free speech. It was a calculated effort to tear down a public figure for entertainment value. With this new evidence, they filed a motion to expand the scope of the lawsuit, calling on ABC to turn over even more documents related to the show's production process. ABC's defense team was feeling the heat. They doubled down on their First Amendment argument. But the more they tried to defend The View, the clearer it became that they had crossed a line. This wasn't just about opinions being expressed. It was about a culture of cruelty being manufactured for profit. The hosts of The View, particularly Joy Behar, had made Melania Trump their punching bag, and they had done so with full knowledge of the damage it could cause. But the most powerful moment in the case came when a former The View producer came forward, anonymously at first, and revealed how the producers of the show had created a target list. Melania Trump was at the top. The producer explained how her name had been discussed in pre-show meetings as a figure to be torn down for laughs. "We knew it would get a reaction," the producer said. "Melania is perfect for it. She's rich, she's quiet, she's easy to hate." The legal ramifications of this new information were profound. Melania's legal team quickly moved to submit the producer's testimony as evidence. They argued that this was not just about one isolated incident on The View. It was about a pattern of behavior that had been cultivated over time. Melania was being targeted repeatedly by a show that had monetized hate and mockery, and this behavior needed to be addressed. As the legal team prepared for depositions, the pressure on ABC and The View grew unbearable. They knew that if the case went to trial, they would be forced to face the consequences of their actions. A large part of the public had already begun to turn against them. Social media platforms were flooded with hashtags like #BouGustice for Melania and #StopMediaHate. Conservative outlets, in particular, rallied behind Melania, calling her lawsuit a stand against the culture of media-led character assassination. Meanwhile, Melania continued to maintain her dignity, even as her lawyers worked tirelessly to build a stronger case. She made one brief statement to the press, where she said, "I did not seek this battle, but I will fight for my name, my dignity, and the dignity of all public figures who have been torn down for sport." In the days that followed, ABC executives met behind closed doors, trying to figure out how to handle the mounting crisis. They considered the option of a quiet settlement, but Melania and her legal team made it clear that they weren't interested in a simple apology or donation. "We do not seek compromise," her spokesperson said. "We seek correction." It wasn't long before ABC issued a public statement. They defended their First Amendment rights and expressed disappointment at Melania's decision to sue. But behind the scenes, the executives were growing increasingly concerned. The View had been their flagship program for years, but now it was becoming a liability. Ratings were slipping, and advertisers were starting to pull out. As the legal battle continued, the courtroom drama began to play out in full view of the public. The hosts of The View were called in for depositions. Joy Behar, Whoopi Goldberg, and Sunny Hostin all sat in front of the legal team, ready to face the music. Behar was the first to testify. Her defense of the foreclosed condo comment, made during the now infamous segment, was weak. She claimed it was all in good fun, but Melania's attorneys quickly shot her down. The internal documents showed that it wasn't fun. It was a calculated insult. Whoopi Goldberg's defense was more solid. She leaned heavily on the First Amendment, claiming that the show's content was protected as free speech. But even she couldn't ignore the mounting evidence that the jokes about Melania were crossing a line. Sunny Hostin, on the other hand, was visibly uncomfortable during her deposition. She had initially defended her comments on air, but now, faced with hard evidence of intentional malice, she struggled to maintain her composure. At one point, Melania's attorney asked her, "Do you have any evidence that Melania Trump was unhappy in her role as First Lady?" Hostin's answer, "I believed it was obvious," fell flat. "Belief isn't evidence," the lawyer responded, and the courtroom went silent. With each passing day, it became clearer that Melania Trump wasn't just defending herself. She was exposing a much larger issue in the media. It wasn't just about her and The View. It was about the media's responsibility to treat public figures with respect and dignity, even if they disagreed with them politically. As the legal proceedings continued, Melania's lawsuit was no longer just a legal issue. It was a cultural moment. It was about the way women in the public eye are treated and the lengths to which media outlets will go to boost ratings. It was about holding the media accountable for the damage they could do with their words. And Melania Trump, once viewed as a silent figure in the background of her husband's political career, had emerged as a formidable force in her own right. She wasn't just fighting back against The View, she was fighting for a new standard of accountability in media. As the trial progressed, the pressure on ABC and The View reached an unbearable peak. The courtroom had become a battleground, not just for Melania Trump's reputation, but for the larger issue of how media treated public figures, especially women, who were seen as politically inconvenient or easy targets. The weight of the evidence against The View was overwhelming, and the public sentiment was turning in Melania's favor. Inside ABC's legal team, the atmosphere had shifted from defensive confidence to anxiety. They realized that this was no longer just a case about one defamatory segment. It was about a broader issue of media ethics. Melania's legal team had effectively uncovered a pattern of targeting her, and that reality was starting to sink in for the network. Melania's legal team continued to deliver punch after punch. They introduced a series of internal communications that revealed The View's editorial strategy was not just about expressing opinions. It was about creating content specifically designed to provoke outrage. The show had even established Melania Trump as a central target for content generation. The producers had recognized that her name alone could drive traffic and increase ratings, even at the cost of personal attacks. As more depositions were taken, the cracks within ABC's defense began to widen. Joy Behar, Whoopi Goldberg, and Sunny Hostin, all of them now faced difficult questions about the intent behind their comments. Joy Behar's infamous foreclosed condo line, which had triggered the lawsuit, was exposed for what it truly was: a personal attack with no basis in fact, aimed at painting Melania as disconnected and aloof. The weight of the evidence became so heavy that ABC's legal team began to discuss the possibility of settlement. However, Melania's legal team was adamant. This case wasn't about money, it was about accountability. They issued a clear message. They weren't seeking a simple apology or a quiet donation to charity. They wanted change. They wanted the media to be held accountable for the way it treats women in the public eye. Behind the scenes, ABC executives were growing increasingly worried. Ratings for The View were tanking. Longtime sponsors were pulling their ads. Even the audience seemed divided. The backlash against the show was significant, with viewers now questioning the ethical practices behind what had once been a beloved morning talk show. Meanwhile, the Justice for Melania movement continued to grow on social media, with many conservative commentators rallying behind her. Melania, who had been quiet for most of her time in the public eye, was now viewed as a symbol of defiance, someone standing up against the system that had repeatedly tried to tear her down. In an unexpected turn, Melania herself made a rare public appearance. She attended a women's conference in Dallas, where she delivered a short but powerful speech. "Speech is free, but slander has a price," she said, addressing the audience. "I'm here to make sure the bill comes due." Her words resonated deeply with many in the audience, and the speech went viral. It was a defining moment, signaling that Melania was no longer a passive figure. She was actively shaping the narrative surrounding her. Her legal battle with ABC was becoming more than just a lawsuit. It was sparking a cultural conversation about the ethics of modern media. Melania Trump, a figure who had long been scrutinized and ridiculed, had now become a voice of resistance, fighting back against a system that had built its profits on making targets out of public figures. The pressure on ABC grew even more intense. With every new revelation, the network's position weakened. Inside the courtroom, the defense team struggled to maintain a coherent argument. The public had begun to see through the veil of satire and comedy that had been used to justify the attacks on Melania. What had once been framed as harmless political commentary now appeared to be something far more malicious, a calculated attempt to destroy a woman's reputation for the sake of entertainment. ABC's lawyers eventually made an attempt to settle, offering a quiet apology and a charitable donation. But Melania and her team rejected this offer outright. They didn't want just a gesture, they wanted a statement of accountability. As the trial continued, it became clear that Melania wasn't simply defending herself. She was fighting for the dignity of all women in the public eye who had been subjected to similar treatment. Her lawsuit had already exposed a broader issue within the media, one that would have lasting implications for how public figures are treated in the future. The fallout from this trial was just beginning. For The View, the consequences were already apparent. The network was forced to make changes. Ratings continued to plummet, and the public's trust in the show was shaken. Advertisers were distancing themselves, and the atmosphere at ABC was far from celebratory. It was a far cry from the days when The View was considered one of the most influential talk shows on television. Melania Trump, once dismissed as a silent and passive first lady, had now become a force to be reckoned with. The media had underestimated her for far too long. She had transformed from a target of ridicule into a symbol of resistance, fighting not only for her own reputation but for the broader issue of how women in the public eye are treated. The courtroom had become the stage for a cultural reckoning, and Melania was leading the charge. The courtroom drama had reached its peak, and the tension was palpable. Both sides were digging in, but as Melania's legal team presented their case, the scale began tipping in her favor. The once confident attorneys for ABC now found themselves on the defensive, their arguments crumbling under the weight of the evidence. What had started as a single defamatory remark from The View had turned into a comprehensive examination of the show's editorial practices. Melania's legal team skillfully highlighted the underlying patterns in the way The View had treated her, emphasizing the calculated nature of the mockery that had been directed at her. They introduced key pieces of evidence, internal emails, text messages, and even memos, that revealed a deliberate strategy behind the segments aimed at her. This wasn't just about political commentary, it was about targeting a woman for personal gain. One email in particular stood out. A producer had written, "Let's do another segment dragging Melania, we know it'll spike viewership." That email alone was enough to make even the most skeptical observers realize that The View had gone beyond the bounds of acceptable criticism. It wasn't just about political opinions or public disagreements. It was about using Melania as a punchline for ratings. The public perception of the trial was evolving. What had initially seemed like an overreaction on Melania's part was now being viewed as a fight for justice. The case became a rallying cry for those who believed the media had crossed a line. People who had long been critical of Melania Trump began to reconsider their stance. The idea that one of the most prominent daytime talk shows could engage in such deliberate character assassination was too much for many to ignore. Joy Behar, Whoopi Goldberg, and Sunny Hostin, the hosts who had participated in the segments mocking Melania, were now the subjects of harsh scrutiny. What had once been framed as witty banter was now being exposed as something much darker, an orchestrated campaign of ridicule with the goal of boosting ratings at the expense of a public figure's dignity. The irony of it all was that The View, a show that prided itself on being a platform for women's voices, was now under fire for mistreating one of the most famous women in America. As the depositions unfolded, the weight of the case became clearer. ABC's defense had relied heavily on the argument that The View was a show built on satire and free speech, but this defense was increasingly falling flat. Melania's team exposed how the content targeting her had crossed into something more dangerous: defamation with malicious intent. Sunny Hostin's own words during her deposition, where she had defended the segment by claiming that Melania's silence was evidence of her unhappiness, were used against her. The line between satire and harmful defamation became blurred as it became clear that the hosts had gone beyond political critique and into personal attacks. The uncomfortable truth began to surface. The View had exploited Melania for entertainment, knowing full well that their remarks were cruel and unjustified. The turning point in the trial came when Melania's team presented a clip from the show where Behar had mocked Melania's Christmas decorations. The court had already seen the offensive comments, but now they were presented alongside internal communications that revealed just how far producers were willing to go to make Melania the target of ridicule. The show's own analytics had shown a spike in viewership when segments mocking Melania aired. This wasn't comedy. It was a calculated move to profit from someone else's humiliation. The legal battle had gone beyond just protecting one person's reputation. It had become a broader conversation about the ethics of media, the responsibilities of public figures, and the boundaries of free speech. Could a show like The View continue to mock public figures without consequences? Melania's legal team was determined to ensure that the answer to that question was no. As the trial neared its conclusion, ABC's legal team made one final attempt to settle. They offered an apology and a donation to a charity of Melania's choosing, hoping to diffuse the growing storm. But Melania's team rejected this offer outright. They were no longer interested in token gestures. This was about holding The View accountable for its actions. The case was set to be decided soon, but the damage had already been done. The public had witnessed how Melania, once dismissed as a passive figure, had fought back with strength and conviction. Whether or not she won the lawsuit, she had already won a moral victory. She had shown the world that even those who are often written off can rise up and make their voices heard. The verdict was imminent, and the world was watching. Would Melania Trump emerge victorious, or would the media once again be able to avoid the consequences of their actions? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain. Melania Trump had reshaped the conversation about how women in the public eye are treated.